Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
And my name is Matt.
And today's episode is all about personal history. And we're looking at two films where the characters in it are editing their own stories. So the two films we're looking at this week are The Butterfly Effect from 2004 and The Girl Who Leapt Through Time from 2006. First off, Matt, how did you get on with these two films?
I really enjoyed both of these. I haven't seen Butterfly Effect since around the time it came out, and I had never seen The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, but I really wanted to, and I couldn't believe it came out in 2006, and it's taken me 14 years to watch it. Made me feel very old, and that time is just racing away from me, but I was really happy to finally see that film, because I really liked it. What about you?
You literally leapt through time and then have suddenly revisited that film.
Yeah, the wrong way, though.
Yeah, I hadn't seen Butterfly Effect in a really long time, and I know we were dubious about it, and we're going to reveal how we felt about revisiting this film, because it had a terrible, terrible Rotten Tomatoes score, didn't it?
Well, let's get into that and see how well it holds up.
Remember when we were kids and I used to have those blackouts? Well, some of those memories have been coming back to me.
There are moments in life we choose to remember.
Do you think that we'll be together forever?
And some memories we can never forget.
All I know is that by reading these journals, I might be able to get Kaylee back.
I'd think twice about what you're doing. You could wake up a lot worse off than you are now.
Okay, let's take it back to 2004 and The Butterfly Effect. So this is Ashton Kutcher's serious role. This is him being the serious guy. I'm doing a drama film. Everything's very serious. I'm not the comedy guy from the 70s show this time round. I'm a producer on this film.
This is his Truman Show.
Yeah, that's it. He's really trying to sort of be taken seriously as an actor. I don't think I should say seriously anymore because I've said that a lot. I think I've made my point. This is Ashton Kutcher being very serious. So first off, just flat out, what did you think about going back into this film?
Like I said last week, I was a little bit nervous because I remember really, really liking it when I saw it when I was a teenager. How old were we in 2004? 16, I think?
Yeah, probably about 16. Yeah.
So target audience for this film when it came out. And this is a real go and watch this film at your mate's house when you're too young to drink, and so all you do is go and watch films together. That was kind of my memory of it, and I loved it from that time. But seeing the reviews, I was a bit like, oh, is this going to be a big piece of shit? And I still really liked it. I can kind of see why it might not be regarded as the sci-fi classic that I thought it was in my head. But I certainly enjoyed watching it. What about you?
I definitely didn't like it as much as I did when I was a teenager. I mean, it's interesting, and there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of time travel and how it works in this film. But I do have my issues with it as well.
Do you want to get into your issues now, or are they going to come out as we go through it?
They'll come out as we get through it, I'm sure. And then you'll probably say some stuff and it'll turn my mind around, and then I'll be back at square one. But that's why we do the podcast. Okay, well, let's get straight into the time travel of the film. And it's all driven by Evan, the main character, serious Ashton Kutcher, who is an inadvertent time traveler. He has some sort of ability that's just inherent, right? What triggers his abilities? So his ability doesn't show itself or manifest until he's in his teenage years. He's past his teenage years. In fact, he's like a young adult at this point, isn't he? He's at college/university. He's studying he's psychology, something to do with brains. He's doing all this intense science study, and and then one day he realizes that he can travel back into moments in time from his life that he'd previously blacked out during, which is quite a weird little concept, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're shown that through the structure of the film, which is that we don't get to Ashton Kutcher in college for quite a bit, like the first act of the film, or maybe not quite that much. First of all, we have like a speedy run through of Evan's young life as a child, which introduces us to that concept of the blackout. So we see like 4 or 5 key events from Evan's childhood that initially are just there to show you that he's kind of had a really messed up, unpleasant childhood, that would have been unpleasant anyway, but on top of that unpleasantness, he was experiencing those blackouts as well. That it seems a little bit like epilepsy or something like that, a neurological condition that's causing him to black out, but also I think he's having like seizures as well, right? That when he's blacked out. And then he comes to and he's just got no memory of the preceding few minutes.
Yeah, because the structure is weird, isn't it, of the film? Like the first scene that we actually see is when Evan's in the psychiatric ward. Time travel, there's got to be a psychiatric ward in there somewhere. Always the case. So he's running around and then he finds a journal and then it's like a flashback from there to his past life. So even the first image is kind of like referring back to a flashback. So like we go back to him as a kid and then we're kind of told the story from there, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that initial like prologue scene that sets up the tension later in the film, that and the key plot point that everything Evan is doing is motivated by trying to save someone, save her, he says, at the start of the film. Although later when he starts making the changes, it's not all about her, or he goes down other avenues because of circumstance, and Kaylee becomes less of a focus at times, but she's always on his mind in his time traveling.
Yeah, so Kaylee, who's like Evan's love of his life, basically. He's known her since he was a little kid, and she's been like a fundamental part of his life just in general. But to go back to the blackouts, these blackouts are all in very traumatic times in his life. Now, this is one of the things I did have a bit of a problem with the film. It's kind of like all of the most traumatic things you can think of are just chucked into this guy's childhood.
Yeah.
And it seems a bit overkill. Like, so what happens? He's a bit like Kevin, and we need to talk about Kevin at the start. His mum thinks he's a little psychopath because he's drawing like crazy drawings of killing people. And then he's got a knife at one point. So it's like, what's going on here? He's a bit disturbed. So they kind of set that up. And then later on, when he first sort of like meets Kaylee's dad gets him and Kaylee down in the basement and he's going to shoot a film with them. So basically, Kaylee's dad is a paedophile and there's some really dark stuff going on down there.
I was really, really shocked by that because somehow that had completely slipped out of my mind. I didn't remember that plot point at all.
Did you have a blackout?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll check my journals and see if I wrote about it. But yeah, I found it because it's so unpleasant. And I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, that I'm more squeamish than I used to be. And like really dark concepts on film, or I guess squeamish isn't the right word because I can still watch it and it's fine. But it upsets me and it unsettles me.
Yeah, it's disturbing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was really taken aback by how dark this film got and how quickly it got dark. And it was straight in with that paedophilia plot point that I'd completely forgotten. And then later there's a dog in a bag that gets burned to death, which I absolutely hated that. Or, I mean, I didn't hate it, but it really upset me. It was a really shocking thing and a shocking scene to see. And all of this is happening to child actors as well. Like, the dialogue's really dark and really violent. And yeah, it was very shocking. And I was shocked by how shocking it is. And, being a 16-year-old seeing it, I was just like, whatever, yeah, cool, violence, yeah. And it didn't hit me in the same way.
And like, there's like even more that goes on as well, because there's the moment with the letterbox or the post box, and they put a bomb in there, and that ends up killing a woman and her baby.
Yeah, I actually thought that was quite a good twist. That I'd forgotten and I didn't see it coming. But again, it's shocking and incredibly violent and unpleasant. Yeah,
but it's like all of these things really mount up. Like Evan's best friend kills his dog. He's made to do like some sort of paedophile film with his next door neighbor. His mum's taking him to counseling sessions. His dad's in a psychiatric ward. It feels like too much. And they're really trying to hammer home that this guy has had the worst possible upbringing. His life has been terrible. But his mum's still a good mum. And he's still got like a good sort of like environment other than that. But there's a lot of shit that's happened to him. And I think that's the thing which kind of like was a bit too much for me, because if they'd kept it a bit more streamlined, then that would have worked a bit better in my opinion, because it's just like you don't need to hammer it home so much. But I can see sort of like why these moments are picked, because these are the most traumatic moments in Evan's life. So they have to be punchy. And these are the moments where he can travel back in time. So he can only go to these really traumatic moments where he's blacked out, apparently.
Right. So that's interesting, because that's kind of a good explanation for why these traumatic and horrible events have to be in the film. But I wasn't totally sure that was how the time travel worked. To get to the very end of the film, at the very end of the film, he goes back to like a birthday party where nothing bad happens. And he uses like a home video to do that. That's not a traumatic memory. I thought it was more like he chose the traumatic memories to go to when he discovered that he had the ability to go into any memory through the journals. But at the same time, I was wondering if the blackouts that he experienced as a kid meant that the time travel was always going to happen at those points, because the blackout signified a time when future Evan had come and inhabited his body as a child. But I guess that's not the case because of what happens at the end of the film.
Yeah, it's kind of trying to say both though, isn't it? It's kind of like, it's got a bit of a mixed message because, so if you look at the drawing bit, for instance, so that's clearly one moment when he went back in time after he'd messed up his future. And that's why he drew that picture of the, of him killing people, because in that alternate timeline, is he drawing him killing people?
He's drawing someone killing people. Please do finish your point, because I kind of thought that was unexplained, and I was wondering about that by the end of the film. Like, that seemed like a bit of a dangling thread that never got explained. But are you saying he did that deliberately?
Yeah, he was trying to do something to change the past. So that's the moment that he could go back into. So that's the quickest thing that he could do. And then he does the, he puts his hands on those nails and gets the stigmata sort of signs.
Yeah, but the drawing's got nothing to do with the stigmata. He uses that moment to go back so that he can create stigmata and get leverage in prison. But the drawing, I don't think the drawing had anything to do with that, did it? Like, that didn't help his cause.
No, but that drawing had always happened, even in the alternate timeline, if you get what I mean. So he'd always drawn that.
And crucially, him drawing it caused an incident with his mum, which caused him to write about it in the journal, which gives him an opportunity to go back there.
Oh, Mrs. Boswell.
Jesus, it's a miracle. Look, the stigmata, man.
What'd you see? What did it look like?
The signs of the Lord, man, they just come out of nowhere. Man, I thought you were fucking crazy, man.
So now you believe me?
Straight up, man.
Thinking about those moments again, the fact that he's going back to the blackout moments. So it's something about the trauma, and the fact that he can black out those moments is probably why he grows up to be so well adjusted, because he's at university, he's got like a good sort of like career on the way from the looks of it. And all of his friends from the past who also went through these traumatic moments, they've all turned out terribly. So we revisit Kaylee, and she's working as a waitress. She's getting touched up by customers. She's clearly not happy with her life. And then there's Tommy, who's doing whatever he's doing, but he's always going to be a bit of a fucked up kid after all those traumatic moments. And Lenny as well, he's like lost it from seeing the dog die and like being part of the explosion that killed that mum and that baby. So yeah, so the fact they've all had to deal with the traumatic moments and he hasn't, I think is important as well, because his life's all right, but he wants to go back and try and make things better for everybody else and get sort of like the perfect life.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting observation. I think that is a fair explanation for why Evan turns out fairly normal. Because I found that one of the most jarring bits of the film is you go through all of that extreme traumatic stuff, and then it's just like cut to Ashton Kutcher in university and his professor's saying something like, "Man, Evan, you're the smartest damn kid I've ever seen." Like, and he's played by the Dude, Where's My Car guy. And it just felt so jarring to go from one extreme to then he's like, "Hey man, how's it going? I've got a happy life." But yeah, like you're right. It's the blackout. It's like he doesn't remember the baby dying because he never actually saw that. He's going to see it as a young man at college when he goes back there. So he hasn't got the worst memories that Kaylee, Tommy, and Lenny share. But then he does go into his past version of himself and he's reliving these scenes, but he's played by the young actor, one of the kids that plays younger Evan, who's now speaking as an adult, you know, saying things in like a grown-up cadence. Did you find that like disconcerting, this child actor talking like a grown man?
Well, I was trying to think of whether we've seen that before, because have we seen time travelers going back and then re-entering their younger bodies? Because I know it's something which you see in X-Men, Days of Future Past, which we're going to cover later on the podcast, in a very sort of like interesting way with Wolverine in that film. But the idea of sort of like going back in time, every time we've seen it in other films, they've just been going back and they are the person that they are in their present, but they're just back in their past. Whereas in this, Evan is going back into his memories to an extent, and he's like, he's back in his childhood body. And there's something like a bit different about that, isn't there?
Yeah, it makes him eerie, like a kind of like a horror movie child, which I thought was interesting because a lot of this film really reminded me of like late 90s, early 2000s slashers, just in the way that it's made and the way that it looks and the pacing and the kind of just the overall feel of it. And that kind of adds into it just like the idea of creepy kids. I know you hate creepy kids on film, James.
I hate them. They're bloody terrible.
So it did have a bit of an element of that. But they kind of use it more because he's still like the hero of the scene, and he's still very active rather than creepy, I guess. You know, he's like fending off the paedophile, and it's a real like retribution moment. What if you could go back and say to an abuser the things that you would say to them now, and say it in the moment? It's that kind of an experience for him and for the audience in that sense.
Yeah, and I really like this idea of sort of like traveling back in time and then controlling your past body as well. There's an anime series called Erased, which I would seriously recommend to anyone. It's on Netflix at the moment. And that's basically what happens in that. And I kept thinking about that when watching The Butterfly Effect again. So in Erased, it's there's this guy who his mother is killed, and then he suddenly finds himself back in time to when he was a kid. And there's a link between the murder of his mum and this murderer who was around when he was a kid. And he sort of like takes control of his childhood body, and it's about him trying to sort of like solve the murder which was happening when he was a kid so he can save his mum in the future. And it's really good. It's like, I'm probably not doing it justice with my explanation, but it's definitely worth looking at. And yeah, it's on Netflix.
I will check that out. So it's kind of the same thing using your past body and jumping into it. I feel like the closest thing we've seen to that this series is like Je T'aime and Slaughterhouse 5. But in both of those films, for me anyway, there was a bit of a question mark over whether the characters were really, you know, sending their consciousness into their bodies in the past and in the future, or if it was more like a third person spectator for them, where they were like watching a movie of their lives. I don't think that was quite explained. I think in Slaughterhouse 5 there's a couple of moments where he's definitely like taking control of the situation, but we certainly haven't seen it to the extent of the butterfly effect where he's going back to his childhood and possessing his childhood body. So the time travel in this film is almost like astral projection. There's no time machine. It's just sending your consciousness through time, and your consciousness is inhabiting the same space as it did in that time, but your body's not. Your body is left wherever Evan is in the present day, 2004.
There's this sort of idea of editing again, isn't it? Like we saw in Jatem and Slaughterhouse 5, this sort of like the power of the edit, but they take this to a different sort of like angle with this, because he is editing those moments. So he's only got those moments to which he wants to go back to, but he wants to change them each time and try and see what effect that will have on the rest of his life. The effect that it has is to create different alternate realities, right? And those alternate realities, they completely change his entire world. So there's one reality. The first time he does something big to change the past, he suddenly wakes up and he's a frat boy, and then he's in bed with Kaylee. And it's just a completely different life to the one he was living before. And we talked about alternate realities several times on the podcast so far. And the idea that if you change something in the past and you go back and then everything's completely different, what effect that would have on you. And they kind of had the frequency thing in this as well, because he's got like a rush of new memories, but he still has the past memories of the reality he was in beforehand.
Yeah, I really like the way that was done in this film as well, because I liked it as a concept in frequency, and they add a little extra dimension in the butterfly effect because it's causing him real physical pain. And as the movie progresses, it becomes a plot point because it's not just pain, it's causing him actual measurable brain damage, explained as the experience of 40 years worth of memories being developed in someone's brain over the course of like 24 hours or whatever the time span of the movie is. I thought that was really good. I thought that was a really cool concept, and they did it quite well in this film. I thought it was one of the best things about the film, actually.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you there. That's sort of like, it is an interesting concept, the idea that you've got all those memories inside you as well. So each time he's starting these new alternate realities, he's still got all of the memories of his past lives in his head.
Yeah, and he's just adding more on top of that, similar to what's happening in Frequency, as I said. And I did notice at the end of the film, Toby Emmerich was credited as executive producer of this, and he was the guy who wrote Frequency. So you can see where he might have brought in some of those elements and influenced a bit of the production of this film.
That's interesting, because they are like, I was thinking there was a bit of a link there, but I didn't imagine that it was the guy who wrote Frequency who'd had his input in this. That's weird as well, because there's the sort of like father-son thing in this as well, isn't there? But with this, it's the sort of like they're estranged, and there's like the genetic time travel as well. So what did you think about that?
Yeah, so we've got this condition that Evan has, the blackouts that later in life develop into this kind of astral projection time travel. And it's explained in the film that his dad basically has the exact same condition. His dad's locked up in a psychiatric hospital, and he's just like kind of written off as, oh, I've got this crazy dad at the start of the film. But it transpires that what Evan's going through is exactly the way that his father Jason behaved when he was younger. And it's this inherited trait that whatever is going on with Evan is inherited. I don't know. I feel like the film didn't quite make enough of it. It does build up to a really good scene where Evan's dad tries to kill him as a child and it turns out that it's because he's talking in this adult future way. That's a really great scene, but the concept, I don't think they did enough with it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they could have gone further with it, definitely. I did quite like the idea that it's passed down in that way. So it's like, but it's also sort of like, it's weird the fact that whole moment when Evan is talking to his dad is weird, because has that moment always happened? So if Evan's creating alternate realities every time he's traveling back, how come that was always his past. The similar to how that drawing's made at the start. How do those moments relate? And if he's traveling in alternate realities, is he traveling? Do you get what I mean? Because I don't know if that quite tracks.
I get what you mean in the sense that I don't think it's properly explained in the film. And that's what I mean about when I was watching it, I was initially thinking that the blackouts signify a period where time travel had already happened. And the reason that he blacked out was that his future self was taking over his body. But you're right, that doesn't quite track with what happens in the film, because then when he goes back, the things that he's doing during the blackouts cause alternate realities in 2004. So yeah, I don't think it quite tracks. So I think the only way you can really interpret it is that the condition that Evan has causes blackouts, and that's kind of a separate symptom to what allows him to travel through time by reading his notebooks. And he's just using these windows of blackouts because they're memorable events in his young life. He definitely wrote about them in the notebooks, and it's an opportunity to travel back, and he knows that he's going to be able to travel back, and there's an empty body, I guess.
Would you have liked to have seen or heard about more of Evan's dad's experience with time travel? Would that have sort of added a bit more for you?
Well, just for the fact that he's played by Callum Keith Rennie, absolutely yes. Because I love Callum Keith Rennie. He's great in this film. He's great in Battlestar Galactica. He's great in Due South, and I don't think I've ever seen him in anything else.
Due South, I forgot
and that's
he was
fine.
in Due South.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he's the second Ray Vecchio, and he's amazing in that, and I absolutely love him. I'm sure I've seen him in some other stuff, but those are the only things I remember him from. But yeah, I think he's great in this. I would have liked to see a bit more of that, and arguably, I think he would have been a better lead. I think he could have carried this film, but in the same way that, like I said, it made me think of slashers from the same era. It needs that Ashton Kutcher, Amy Smart cast to appeal to the kind of audience that would be interested in those slashers and those films from around this time. The kind of film they're trying to make here doesn't star Callum Keith Rennie in the lead role. That would be more like a Frequency type of film. Just a bit of a slower pace and not 100% traumatic events right at the beginning. That wouldn't happen in the Callum Keith Rennie version of this film, and I think it would have been better. But yeah, it does feel a bit of a shame because he's good in it. Yeah,
he is really good in this film, and it does I would have liked to have seen more about why his time travel didn't work, and sort of I mean, you can get it from what he's saying to Evan in that sequence. Time travel's bad, you're going to fuck things up, don't do it. But there's this whole thing about what Evan was doing previously, and I think this kind of leads into my thing about the film with its female characters. So the female character in this is Kaylee, really, and Evan's mum. And Kaylee is only ever really seen as a prize for Evan. So it's kind of he wants to save her, but he also wants her and wants that perfect life with her. So he wants her to sort of have her brother around, and her brother's fine, and she's with him, and so it's he's constantly trying to save her for his own benefit, really. What did you think about sort of that, and sort of how the female characters in this are all portrayed?
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism of the film, and also all of the conflict between Tommy and Evan comes about because Tommy is similarly possessive of Kaylee and just doesn't want Evan to be involved with her in any way, and it causes him. I mean, Tommy's pretty violent and messed up, and I think the time travel stuff shows that there are a lot of situations where he comes out as a crazy dangerous guy, but a lot of that conflict is coming from his possessiveness over Kaylee. Kaylee's dad obviously is treating her in an incredibly horrible way. The female characters in this film are not getting a fair run of things, are they?
Yeah, and the one sort of alternate reality where Kaylee and her brother are doing fine, so's Lenny, everyone seems to be okay, is the one where Evan's like had his arm blown off. Yeah, and he's really bitter about it. And he's like, oh, Kaylee, you're with Lenny now, and I'm really upset, so I'm going to go back and change it again.
Yeah. I wasn't sure what was going to happen because I forgot how it ended, but I knew we had to get back to is that before or after the when he's in the hospital? That's the prologue bit. I can't even remember.
It's before the hospital bit, because then he goes back, then he ends up killing Kaylee.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, and I thought that he was just going to like sort of sadly accept that this was the best reality, because it's like, you know, I mean, Tommy's the most striking example in that one, isn't he? We've seen him as just a terrifying, violent, aggressive guy in every reality. And in this one, he's found Jesus. He's a preppy guy, really smartly dressed. He's at college. He's completely well adjusted. And everyone's just turned out happy. And all four of them are still friends into adulthood. And Evan's like, I mean, I completely understand Evan's like lost his arms. Like, he's very upset. But I really did think he was going to just kind of accept his lot at that point and just accept that that was the best reality he could create.
I kind of feel like it's not even just sort of like the loss of his arms. He's really, he wants Kaylee still. Like, that's his thing. He's still driven by that.
And Kaylee's clearly happy with Lenny. And she has a great life. And they all have a great life. But yeah, there's some selfishness coming in there.
Yeah, and then when he goes back and he ends up killing Kaylee, he obviously doesn't write any of the journals. So then he's in this weird conundrum where he can't go back anymore. But so we've seen Evan without any arms. We've seen him with a goatee. We've seen him as like a preppy boy. We've seen him as sort of like a 90s grunger almost. So like, what did you think about, like, I kept thinking about all the weird looks that they made for Evan to make sure that you knew he was in a different reality. Did you think that was a bit overkill, or did you enjoy it?
It's pretty simple, but I did like it. I really like the way when he first...
I just thought it was silly.
When he first wakes up in the preppy reality and he's like, where are my clothes? And she's like, it's just down there. And it's like a bright yellow polo shirt. And then you see him fully dressed. He's got like the baseball cap on. He looks ridiculous.
But it's when he goes into the bathroom and he's looking at himself and he's like, oh, what's going on? I've got a goatee now as opposed to my beard. And it's like, come on, that's like the least of your concerns right now.
Yeah, not great. I've got nothing to defend it on. This isn't the film that I'm going to try and like change your mind on, James. You're absolutely right. It was pretty silly. That was a very silly moment.
Yeah, but it's just like you've got those silly things, but then you've got all this really serious dark stuff that's sort of like underlying it. So I think that's where I had the issues revisiting this, because it's just like a bit of a mad mismatch.
Yeah, you can't have the same character. You can't have the character who's looking at himself and being shocked that he has slightly different facial hair and wears a yellow t-shirt. You can't have that be the same character who's going to travel through time to rescue a child from a paedophile. That the tonal mismatch of that is too much. I get what you mean.
What time is it?
It's time for you to do what I tell you to do.
Wrong answer, fuckbag. This is the very moment of your reckoning. In the next 30 seconds, you're gonna open up one of two doors. The first door will forever traumatize your own flesh and blood.
What's happening? How are you doing this?
It'll change your daughter from a beautiful child into an empty shell whose only concept of trust was betrayed by her own sick pedophile father. Ultimately, it'll lead to her suicide. Nice work, Daddy.
So Evan's going through all of these crazy alternative realities until he ends up in the psychiatric ward where he can't go back anymore. And the ending is what really shocked me, because I didn't realise until the end that I'd only ever seen the director's cut.
What?
So I was really shocked by the end of this.
Why? What have you seen?
Because it's not how I remember it ending. So run through the ending of this, how you watched it and how you remembered it.
So as you were saying, he's in the hospital. We've had this whole scene where we're talking about the damage it's doing to his brain. So it's kind of introducing an element of limited time travel that he's physically capable of doing. and he just goes back through the home video that I mentioned earlier, and it's not a blackout. He goes back to like a happy or just relatively safe memory from his childhood and just tells young Kaylee, just get out of here. I hate you. Never talk to me. I'll kill you if you talk to me. Thus, just severing any ties with her for the rest of his life, because he's accepted that he's not good for her. It's a shame he didn't accept that in the reality where she was happy and with Lenny, but he accepts it this final time. He's accepted it, and he's just, I'm bad for this woman. I can't help her. And he just gets out of it. And then he wakes up. He's still best mates with Lenny. So Thumper's kind of disappeared at this point, but he's best mates with Lenny. And then they burn all the notebooks and all the home videos and all the photos and all of that, because that's his way of getting back and traveling through time. And he's like, I don't need that anymore, so we'll just burn it. Time travel is dangerous. Dad was right. And then that's the end of the film, I think. What have you seen?
Yeah. So that's not what I remembered. So when I saw that happening, I was like, oh, that's different. So in the version which I'd initially saw, and I checked this just to make sure my memory wasn't playing tricks on me. So what happens is he's watching the home movie at the end, and the home movie isn't of that party. It's of his mum giving birth. And it's sort of like just her going into the delivery room. And then he suddenly time travels back to when he's in her belly.
I've seen this.
And yeah. And then he strangles himself.
Yes, I've seen that. I have seen that.
Yeah, so he kills himself before any of this happens. And it's kind of like a bit more of a Donnie Darko ending. And that fits for me more with the sort of like dark undertones of the film. And I say undertones, the blatant things that are happening in the
loud
film.
overtones.
The loud overtones. But yeah, so it's like, so when I saw that happy ending, I was really confused, but I can see why Hollywood would want that as the ending for this, because that sort of like fits, doesn't it? But I much prefer this sort of like the darker ending and sort of like, but it's still quite depressing, but I think it fits more for me in the sort of themes.
Kind of. He's doing it. He does it as a fetus, doesn't he? My only like problem with that is like, is a fetus's, well, it's not a fetus. It's a, about to be born baby. But like, would he have would he literally have the control over his limbs? I guess is what I'm saying. Babies do not have any control over their limbs. They're babies. Would that even be physically possible? But yeah, I do remember that, and I do remember it being a good like dark ending. So I must have seen that as well. I liked the way it ended. I liked the way that it was just like, it's the same message, isn't it? He's decided that Kaylee's always been his focus, and in the theatrical cut ending, he makes the decision that like, I'm no good for her, so I'll just cut our relationship off at the earliest point. It's still the same conclusion that the character is coming to in the director's cut. He's just taking a more extreme nuclear option and just writing himself out of existence.
Yeah, because the key thing for him is that him being in Kaylee, Tommy, and Lenny's lives has led to them having those traumas which have like dramatically changed the course of their lives because he was there.
But in that reality, and also in the theatrical cut reality, what about Tommy and Kaylee's dad? So
the whole reason for that is because Kaylee only stayed with her dad because she liked Evan and wanted to stay near him. So yeah, so when Evan's,
yeah,
that's it. So as soon as they live with the mum, they're fine. There's no more creepy paedophile dad. Everything's good.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I forgot about that. So he's just a negative impact on their lives, whatever he does. Yeah.
Yeah, but he doesn't mean to be. Like he's always quite like, he means well to an extent. I mean, a lot of it is him being possessive over Kaylee, but he like wants them to have good lives, but he wants to be a part of that. And as soon as he's like, right, I'm gonna do something which is a bit more selfless in the theatrical cut, then it's sort of like it all pans out.
Missed you. I'll never let you miss this.
Like the sacrifices our parents have made for us to be here today.
right? Where's Kaylee? Who's Kaylee? Who's Kaylee?
So Evan is being a little bit selfish with his time travel in this film. There's another character who is also doing fairly selfish stuff with her time travel, and she is going to be the main protagonist in the film we're going to talk about next, which is the Girl Who Leapt Through Time from 2006.
What you experienced was a time leap.
Time leap?
You see, time can never be reversed. So it was you that went back in time.
The Girl Who Leapt Through Time from 2006, directed by Mamoru Hosoda. This was a really big crossover hit, wasn't it? A big Japanese anime film that was a worldwide success as far as I can remember. It seemed like a big deal at the time. And certainly I think it paved the way for films like Your Name, which was an even bigger hit. It was kind of filling a space that really Studio Ghibli had a bit of a stranglehold on in terms of crossover hits from Japanese animation in Europe and America. This was a really big movie, but it completely passed me by. I wanted to see it, like I said in the intro, and it took me ages to see it. I was blown away by it. I thought it was just so good. It was just an absolute delight to watch. Had you seen this film before, or was this your first time watching it?
It was my first time going into this one. I'd heard about Hosoda a lot for like his other works and things like that, and people have recommended his stuff to me before. I didn't realise, but I had already seen a couple of things from him. So do you remember Digimon from the 90s?
Of course I remember Digimon.
Well, I say 90s, I think it was like hitting the 2000s. But he did the Digimon movie. And he also did a series called Samurai Champloo. So I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's kind of like, it's got like a hip hop kind of soundtrack. So I obviously loved it. It was anime and it was hip hop.
Oh, wow.
I'm on it. So yeah, so that was great. So I'd seen those bits from him, but I hadn't, because The Girl Who Leapt Through Time was his proper sort of like his big hit.
Yeah, it was a big one. And I think it may have been helped certainly in Japan by the fact that it's the name carries a lot of weight. So it's based on a novel from the 60s that's been adapted into, from what I could see, at least 3 movies. And this isn't the first movie adaptation of it. So, audiences would have been familiar with the plot and the basic concepts. I think he's put quite a unique spin on it because the plot's quite different to the original story. I think it's even completely different characters that's been created for this film, although fitting into a template, let's say. But yeah, it's got that kind of heritage behind it. But I don't want to do it down. It's a really, really lovely, charming film, and I think that's what's fundamental to its success more than any kind of priming or familiarity.
Yeah, it's got a lot of heart, hasn't it? And it's sort of what you come to expect from these kind of tonal animes, like the ones which are directed more sort of like young adults and adults. They've got a bit more weight to them in terms of sort of themes and things like that, and that all comes across in this.
Yeah, and there's a human story underpinning that as well. I think the crossover anime hits in the movie world were more reserved for the more niche, more complex sci-fi storylines like Ghost in the Shell that we looked at a couple of series ago, Akira, that I still don't really understand the plot of, no matter how many times I've seen it. This has that kind of domestic melodrama and romance that has a sci-fi concept mixed up and kind of mushed into it, but those characters feel very real, and that's what's at the heart of the story.
Yeah, because it's so character driven, and it feels a bit like a like one of those films about sort of like summer love and teenage love and that kind of thing, sort of a coming of age. It's very much a coming of age film, isn't it? And that's sort of like centered around this character Makoto. Now, she's like the time travel in this it comes a bit sort of like unexpected, doesn't it? Because it's so much just a tale of a teenager at the start, and then suddenly the time travel aspect comes in. But it's not like how we've seen time travel used in a lot of films where it's a bit more serious. It's very light-hearted with its time travel use at the start. And it's more sort of like akin to something like Bill and Ted in terms of how she uses the time travel. She's just sort of like along for the ride, and she uses it for quite sort of like menial things and stuff like that. But it all starts with her having a terrible day, doesn't it?
Yeah, not just a terrible day, but I think she's kind of having a bit of a terrible, clumsy life. She's narrating a particular day where everything just kind of goes wrong for her. She starts a fire in cookery class. She gets someone just like tumbles into her and sends her flying, and she's having all these like mishaps and accidents, but she's narrating it saying, this isn't like me. I'm normally very calm and collected. But I got the sense that was not the case, and she is the sort of clumsy character we see at the start of the film. And that clumsiness builds up to her falling on a walnut. And then she can travel in time. Was that right? Did I understand that correctly?
That's pretty much what happens, isn't it? Yeah. It's so strange, that sequence, isn't it? Like, I didn't know how they were going to get into the time travel in this, but they do it in a very unique way by slipping on a walnut. But it's not a walnut. It's a special time travel device, which we'll explain a bit more later. But what did you think about that first time travel sequence and how that sort of came about?
I thought it was really, really well not shot. These films aren't shot. It was really well animated. The pace of it. So she's on her bike and she realizes her brakes are broken, which is, I think, the first instance. No, it's not even the first instance. The whole like first third of the film sets up a load of little plot points that come back more than once, and they loop back round to and become very important. So like the fire in the cookery class that I mentioned and stumbling into someone, all of that becomes part of her time travel, similar to, we've seen it in like Groundhog Day, where it sets up a precedent of like the stuff that's going to happen to the character within the time loop. But Girl Who Leapt Through Time does so much more with it, and it kind of drives a lot of the plot points later in the film. Anyway, she's on this bike with the broken brakes, and she goes headlong into a tram over what's that called? A level crossing, but for a tram. And it's
a train, isn't it?
Was it a train? I thought it was
train or tram.
It doesn't really matter.
Some sort of large vehicle coming towards her on rails.
Probably a bloody monorail. It's so futuristic in Japan, isn't it? Bloody got everything over there, aren't they? So she goes flying into that, and the editing is incredible. It's like really, really tense, rapid editing as we're hurtling towards that, and she's like, "Oh, I can't believe this is happening." And then what exactly happens? Where does she wake up immediately after? Is she just at the back at the top of the hill?
She's at the top of the hill, yeah. So she's just leapt back rather than into the trajectory of the vehicle which is coming towards her. So
what I found really interesting was, as a fan of sci-fi and someone who does a sci-fi podcast, and we're talking about it all the time, that was completely fine. I just accepted that she's the girl who leaps through time, and this is her doing time travel, and I'm settled into that concept. What I thought was really interesting was what happened next, which was she goes to talk to her aunt and just has a really frank conversation about it, saying like, this is what happened to me. And her aunt's like, oh yeah, sounds like you had a time leap. It's completely normal. Happened to me. What did you think of that character that was just basically saying she went through the same thing when she was young?
I thought she was great. Like, she calls her Aunt Witch, doesn't she? And her official name, when she's credited in the credits, is the same as the protagonist of the original Girl Who Leapt Through Time novel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of implied that her aunt is the one from that story, and then she's like having a similar adventure in time travel herself.
That's really interesting. That was lost on me. I didn't know that that was what was going on there. I couldn't tell if in that first half of the film, I couldn't tell if she was joking, because part of the way that the scene kind of plays out is it might just be that she's just a very patient aunt with a good sense of humor who's got a wacky, clumsy daughter who would say something like, oh, sounds like you just leapt through time. Don't worry about it. You're okay. No one got hurt. Let's carry on. And like, so I thought she might have been joking, or then I did also wonder if that was the explanation for the time travel, because this walnut she fell on, like you said, it doesn't really come into it until later. So I was also sort of primed to just accept that it was another genetic trait, like in Butterfly Effect. But I don't know. They kind of played their cards close to their chest on that one, and I was never really sure what was going on with Makoto's aunt.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the mystery of it. And it kind of like you said before, you don't really have to know about the ins and outs of the time travel when watching the film, because that's not the main thing that draws you in with this. It's the characters and their sort of like relationships, and all of that element of it is much more interesting in this than perhaps sort of like the reasoning behind the time travel. I mean, they do have like a pretty good explanation for that, but it's more about those characters.
Yeah, and also importantly, they do have an explanation for it, but Makoto's not the type of character who is particularly interested in finding that out. She is more living in the moment and more interested in increasingly using this ability and exploring this ability. So the film doesn't go down that road of explaining it, because the character that we're following is not as interested in that as like a Doc Brown character might be, or whatever, or even Evan in Butterfly Effect, who's interested in testing out and trying to explain it to himself. She just wants to do things a little bit better. So what does she do? What's the first thing that she changes? Is it the cookery class?
Well, she goes through lots of things like that, but I just want to talk briefly about the moment where she first slips on the walnut and just sort of like what happens there. Because when she first experiences, it's not quite time travel, but it kind of sets it up for that moment where she almost gets hit by the train or the tram. So she slips, and then suddenly she's going through time, and then there's like it's like a massive clock around her and cogs and things like that. And then there's horses galloping and all this kind of stuff. So what did you think about that particular moment?
I thought it looked amazing. It was the first, so we had some nice like editing use of animation just or that comes just after, when she gets in the accident. But yeah, that was a really cool animation sequence. It was very psychedelic. The inside of a clock, it's like a white void with neon blue clockwork kind of floating around, and a strip of red that represents like a timeline that I think she can pinpoint where she's going on that timeline. I think that's what was supposed to be represented by that. But before we get into that, there's like swirling Van Gogh painting landscapes that she's flying through. She goes through like the inside of a computer chip, it kind of looks like, as well. And that's before she gets to the clock. The clock is the only thing that becomes like a recurring visual motif for her time travel. But the whole sequence was just very like trippy and psychedelic and cool.
Yeah, and it made me think of sort of like the time stream, or I think I referred to it once as the time warp, when we talked about Flight of the Navigator. That sort of like place where you are in between your time travel. And I think they visualized that in a really nice way in this.
Yeah, and the animation or the animation format allows them to really push the boat on that, whereas other films, non-animated films, are restricted by their budget and the special effects capabilities, I guess. Whereas animation, you can kind of let your imagination run wild a little bit. But yeah, the thing it most reminded me of was the Circuits of Time from Bill and Ted, because that's similarly on the like psychedelic side of things. How does it compare to like Butterfly Effect? Because we didn't really talk about what the time travel looked like in Butterfly Effect.
So in Butterfly Effect, it was kind of like everything just goes out of focus and blurs. So it's kind of like your background changes and then suddenly you're wherever you are in the past.
But there's a sense of violence to it as well, isn't there? It's like the universe itself is shaking apart at the seams, and then Evan pops out through it into his younger body.
It's really weird. So we're doing this on a Zoom call, and then as Matt was saying that, his screen was shaking. So it looked like he was going on some weird time travel excursion. So to bring it back to what you were saying before, what are the things that Makoto changes in her life? So it's also kind of like trivial stuff, isn't it? She goes back so she can have like an extra hour in bed at one point and things like that. So and then she goes to her exam, but she has like, she knows the answers. So it's not a surprise exam anymore. So it's all like little things, which at the time seemed trivial.
Yeah, she passes her test. She kind of skips through all of the embarrassing events that we saw in the introduction to the film. So she calls a classmate over in the cookery class and says, you do this bit, I'm going to go over there. She ducks when someone was about to crash into her in the courtyard. And then the main thing she does is she goes out for karaoke with her friends, and then just
that bit.
Yeah, she just leaves the room when their time is up and they've got 5 minutes left. She just keeps leaving the room and then tumbling back in. I really like the way that when she leaps, she kind of leaps into the air and then she crash lands, but not just like on the floor. She's always doing like a roly-poly into the past, and then she's like bangs her head on something, but then she just gets up because she's so excited about time travel. Like, she's still that clumsy person who enters the past in that clumsy way, but her excitement to be there just like gets her up on her feet, and she's like, yeah, let's do more karaoke.
And it's kind of like an innocence about how she's using the time travel as well. She's not like using it for any sort of grand purposes. She's just like using it, yeah, like you said, so she can just have a bit more karaoke time with her mates. And so she can have the pudding that her sister ate beforehand. So she gets to have her pudding. It's all little things like that. And at first, these sort of things don't seem to have any impact on anyone else. But as the film sort of progresses, you see what doing these little things, how they affect these other people. Again, it's kind of like the butterfly effect. Like, one small thing, chaos theory, can lead to something terrible and the consequences of that.
Yeah, and her aunt calls that to her attention. So her aunt does say like, oh, I'm really glad that you're not doing anything too serious and, you know, you're having fun and all of that. But she does suggest that, oh, well, you never know. Someone might be suffering for your fun. And Makoto's like, no way, you know, what are you talking about? It's fine. But then we start to see the effect that what she's doing is having on the people around her. And that's where I really got into it, and I was really enjoying the film, because it's where all those little seeds that they plant in the first half of the film come to fruition, and we see the impact it's having. So I think the biggest one in the middle is the guy from the cookery class, isn't it? The development of what happens to him over the course of that day or two.
Yeah, because he just has a really bad time, doesn't he? He like ends up getting in a fight, doesn't he? Or something like that. And he's got an extinguisher.
Yeah, he gets teased because of what happened in the cookery class. He lashes out at the people teasing him, and then they hose him down. And it's just this escalation of, bullies, basically, I guess, or a cycle of bullying that's just getting increasingly worse. But building up to like quite a serious event where he throws a fire extinguisher at Makoto's head. Is it Makoto? Yeah, because he blames her.
Yeah, but it doesn't hit her, does it?
No, Chiaki, one of her two best friends, steps in, and this is where things start to get out of control, I think, in the film for Makoto, because...
Does it? I thought it hits that girl, doesn't it?
I think there's 2 or 3 leaps that she does, because Chiaki steps in to protect her, and Chiaki gets it in the head. So then she has to go back again, I think. I think there's more than one. She knocks Chiaki out of the way, but it hits this other girl, Yuri, I think her name is. She's part of like a love triangle. There's like a love triangle, love square, love pentagram. Everyone's got a crush on each other. And Yuri's just this like, innocent girl with a crush who's just on the sidelines and gets wanged by a fire extinguisher.
Yeah, and talking about sort of like the love triangle and everything that's going on there. And one of the scenes I really enjoyed was the moment when Makoto is talking to Chiaki and on the bike, and she redoes this sequence like hundreds of times, because in that conversation, Chiaki asks her out and says, "Do you want to be my girlfriend?" And at that time, Makoto's like, "No, I don't want to be having this conversation. It's too awkward. I don't want it to change our relationship." So she keeps going back to try and rewrite it. And she does this again and again, trying to change topics of conversation until she finally does it. And then when she does it, later on, she goes on to regret it, doesn't she?
Yeah, or doesn't she leave that scene by she just walks off in the end because she can't, there's no way to take that bike ride home with Jackie where it won't get awkward for her. I really like that as well. I thought it made her a really, really sweet character, and it really summed up that like coming of age aspect of the film, that she's someone who she's so happy in this little like adolescent bubble. She's got these two friends, she absolutely loves them, and she just wants to play baseball with them forever, and that's fine. She doesn't want to pick a school subject to study at college. I don't know how the education system works in Japan, but I think it was like choosing your university subject. She doesn't want to do that. She's not that academic. She just wants everything to stay as it is and just play baseball forever. And Chiaki bringing this like romantic element into that is just, she just can't accept it. She's completely blindsided by it, for one thing. She didn't really see things that way. But she also doesn't want to have those conversations with her friends. She doesn't want to lose that friendship. She just wants to stay basically playing catch in the baseball field forever.
Yeah, and it comes back to that quote which she sees in the classroom at that point. Time waits for no one. And that kind of like is the central message of the film, isn't it? Because even though she's got this ability to time travel, it doesn't mean that she can change her life in the way that she wants. And she's kind of like, she's just reliving the same day, because like you said, she wants to just keep having this summer of fun or whatever it is. She wants to have this school life and these friends and be in that moment for as long as she can and make things as good as they possibly can be. But she has that realization later on that time waits for no one. So she has to kind of like let go of that and look at things a bit more seriously.
Yeah, and all of that growing up stuff is coming for these three characters, and you can't avoid it. I think that's the message that they're getting out in the film, and that's what makes it so sweet, I think.
Normally I'm pretty careful, so I've never been hurt too bad, and I make sure not to get involved in complicated relationships.
So that conversation kind of sets the tone for things getting more and more serious. Where does it go from there? Because it gets even more serious with the events of the film that Makoto is trying to gain control of.
Well, it seems like everything that she's done has some sort of negative impact on other people. So she's at this point, she's going back to try and sort things out again and make sure that everyone's back to how it should be to an extent. So she goes back and she like tries to get Kosuke with the girl who fancies him. And there's that whole bit where she's trying to sort of like set them up because she doesn't realize that because of the things she's been doing, there's not been that meeting between the two of them, which would result in them sort of like getting together. And then, yeah, so she first off goes around trying to sort of like enable that situation, doesn't she?
In amongst that, I think we start to see the number on her arm. So she's got like a number that looks like a tattoo or something that's mysteriously appeared on her arm. And that's the beginning of the film, like starting to explain the time travel, but still Makoto's not too interested in that. She's like, oh, that's crazy. There's a number on my arm. And she doesn't acknowledge that it's like a decreasing number until later in the film. But yeah, she's doing these things to try and get this couple together, which ultimately leads to them dying. Is she kind of responsible for the accident that happens to Kosuke? And she's just used up her last leap, hasn't she? That's the point in the film where she's looking down at her arm and it's finally turned to 0, but she's thinking like, well, happy ending, everything's good. So we have this concept of like a limited amount of time travel. We've got Evan with the brain damage that he's experiencing. He can't keep doing it.
Edge of Tomorrow, we've got you can't time travel in that last bit. Tom Cruise has lost the ability to time travel, so he can't reset in the crucial moment. So it adds that jeopardy.
Yeah, in those films, it's adding jeopardy that things are running out. For Makoto, it feels like it's leading to a resolution because she thinks she's got a bit of a happy ending with things, but it suddenly turns into this awful, tragic scene where she's just like charging down the hill trying to save Kosuke from getting hit by the train, which is what almost happened to her at the start of the film. But then we suddenly get like the whole explanation of the plot, and the whole time travel explanation comes unraveling because Chiaki enters the scene. What did you think of that frozen moment that happens immediately after the accident?
It took me aback because I just wasn't expecting it. It was just such a change in pace for the rest of the film. And there were sort of like a few bits which kind of made you think maybe Chiaki could be the other time traveler or the reason that she's got these powers, but they don't point at it very much. It's sort of like just vaguely hinted at until this moment where it's just frozen and he's walking towards her, and then she realizes that it's his time traveling power that she's got.
And she's kind of stolen it, right? I think. He has a finite amount of it. He's come back to the past. There's a load of sci-fi stuff thrown in. He's from like a dystopian future. I think there's been some sort of cataclysmic event because he talks about never seeing a river before and seeing the sky is like a new thing to him. So he's from a really dark future. He's come back to look at a painting. I don't know if there's like more explained in the book because I really didn't understand anything that was going on with the painting.
I felt like the painting was more significant somehow. I don't know. Again, like they don't really explain it in the film, but the fact it's what the aunt is working on, I don't know if there's something in the novel which sort of ties all that together.
I'm sure there must be because it felt like a missing link. I really felt like I wasn't understanding something with all the stuff going on with the painting. But he came back. That's why he came back. But he's also got swept up in exactly the kind of thing that Makoto is swept up in, which is just the joy of just playing baseball with some friends after school and stuff like that. He just wants to stay there and experience that for as long as possible. And Makoto's jumped in and stolen his remaining leaps, and he's down to 0. Or no, he was down to 1, but he has to use that to stop Kusuke from getting hit by a train, which is a situation that Makoto has unwittingly engineered by setting him up with the girl.
So Chiaki also explains that this has happened before. Kosuke has died before, and it had such an effect on Makoto that he went back and tried to change it. And then when he did do that, she ended up getting the time travel abilities. So again, it was kind of like seemed like an inevitable thing that someone was going to get hit by this tram at some point.
Yeah, there's an inevitability, but also that really reminded me of Primer, where again you're seeing characters who experience time travel who are dealing with learning about time travel and what it feels like and what the experience is like. But then at another part of the film, they have this realization where they're living in like a different time loop and they understand enough about time travel to know that that's possible. And there was another version of themselves that experienced things differently and they're in a different timeline. So in Primer, it's they have this realization that someone else got in their time machines and they've changed something. They don't know what it is. And Makoto's got to come to the realization that she's living in a different timeline where Chiaki's had to change things for her own benefit. And it's just like another element of like her meddling is just like making things increasingly worse for everyone else. And even when she doesn't meddle, someone else has to meddle on her behalf for her benefit, and the timeline keeps getting changed because of her. But it's reaching a peak at this point with her friend dying, when it was just such a like playful, silly thing at the start of the film, and this mounting sense of importance and, you know, seriousness.
And that's sort of like the idea of them having lived these moments before. I think that brings Chiaki into a different sort of perspective as well, because if you look at that moment when he's asking Makoto out, he's obviously seen her go through all those painful moments, then gone back, and then he's got like a deeper relationship with her at that point. So for him, it seems like the moment to do that. But whereas Makoto's probably not, she hasn't experienced those moments. So it might be that could be part of the reason why there's that sort of like disconnect there as well.
And he's just more grown up because of what he's experienced in this awful future. But yeah, he's got this added intensity of feeling and relationship. We've seen it before. It happens to Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. It happens to Tom Cruise in Edge of Tomorrow. These characters are forced into a situation where they spend intensely emotional periods of time with other characters and form this bond that the other character then can't fully reciprocate because they didn't experience the same events in the same order.
Yeah, it felt a bit sort of like 12 Monkeys as well, looking back at it, because the relationship in that is kind of like similar in a lot of ways. It's like, it's an intense amount of time, and one of the characters come from a dystopian future back to the past where he's having a lovely time. Yeah.
Yeah, and that he's so desperate to stay there as well, the same way that Bruce Willis wants to live in this dream world, even, and he's just accepting that it's possibly a dream world. And I guess in a similar way, Chiaki's living in a bit of a dream world by thinking that he can be a 2006 teenager when he's a time traveler from the future.
Again, all of this has this kind of like summer of your youth kind of feel to it, doesn't it? Because it's them getting into relationships and asking a girl out for the first time and being rejected, or deciding you like that person, they don't like you anymore, or they've moved on. It's all of those sort of like growing pains that are displayed in this film, which are just so like, they kind of creep up on you throughout the film, don't they? Because it's all just like fun, isn't it? She's traveling back in time and she's doing like funny things, but then all of this more serious stuff of her growing up is happening in the background.
Yeah, those things creeping up on you is really important in terms of what make it such a good film, especially us having seen it in the context of the butterfly effect. And we talked about how the tone just doesn't work very well in the butterfly effect, flipping between the two modes. The way those serious themes creep up on you in The Girl Who Leapt Through Time make it a much better film, because the pacing of that emotion is handled much more professionally and efficiently in this film than in The Butterfly Effect.
Definitely. And I think Hossiter's got he's got the background and the knowledge to do this kind of thing, because there's another film which I really want to see, having seen this, called Mirai, which he did in 2018. And again, that's got time travel elements in it as well. So in that, it's a young boy who's traveling through time and meets his relatives from different eras, but he's guided by his younger sister from the future. So it starts off and it's like, from what I've read and seen, I watched a bit of a trailer as well. So this young boy is about to have a little sister, and then suddenly this little sister is visiting him from the future, and she's older. So it's that sort of like weird dynamic. But I just wanted to mention that because I think anybody who's watched The Girl Who Leapt Through Time would be interested to watch that. I mean, I know I am.
I certainly am, yeah. I want to check that out.
But yeah, I think anime is really good at capturing sort of youth as well, isn't it? It's got all of... Because I think animation in general is just something everybody looks back in from their childhood, like cartoons. They make you happy. You watch them as a kid, and sort of having this as an animation kind of adds that element to it as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that does add another layer to it. It's traditionally a medium that's targeted at kids, I guess.
Targeting something like this at adults, it draws in on that nostalgia factor. And with this being a film about looking back to your younger years and that sort of like the spirit of youth and the summer of youth and all that kind of stuff, the fact that it's animated brings all that to your mind when you're watching it.
How does somebody fall like that? And weren't you just sitting there
Drop
a second
it
ago?
and let's get singing!
Time waits for no one, not even you. Now your mama or your brother and
Hello.
You've got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Thanks. We'll leave right away, okay? Not.
So Chiaki resetting time allows her one more time loop, because he's reset her 0 because he reset time. That resets her 0 to a 1. I'm not sure it entirely makes sense, but that's what happens. Makoto's put back into normal time, and she and Kusuke's fine, but they're basically grieving because Chiaki's disappeared. He's gone back to the future, but from their point of view, it just seems that he's just walked out on their friendship. But Makoto then she realizes she's got this number 1 again, and she does basically what Evan does in both endings of the butterfly effect, which is go back to the beginning of things. She goes back to the moment where she initially fell on this walnut thing, and she's able to have this like really moving conversation with Chiaki. She explains she knows everything. She promises to protect the painting for the future, and they have this like tearful goodbye. But we do get like a satisfying ending, but it's still got to have that kind of mature element of like, you know, sometimes things end sadly and sometimes you have to say goodbye to your friends, and it's that transition into adulthood for her character, isn't it?
Yeah, time's moving on and time waits for no one. So that's it for today's episode. Next week, we will be looking at the theme of doubles in time travel films. So we're taking a look at Looper and Time Crimes next week, which should be a lot of fun. I haven't seen Time Crimes, but I've heard lots of good stuff about it.
No, and it's kind of, I haven't seen it either. It's kind of a horror film, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's like, it's quite a low budget sci-fi, isn't it?
Well, we love those, James.
We do indeed. But yeah, lots of people have recommended Time Crimes and obviously Looper. I haven't seen that for years, but I remember really enjoying it. So we'll see what it's like. I know you have some issues with the time travel in that from previous episodes of the podcast.
I'm interested to see how Looper shapes up watching it again.
Let's see if I want to defend it in the next episode.
Yeah, okay. Looking forward to that. We'll see where we land on Looper. Anyway, in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, please do send us an email. It's journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com, or you can join us on the discussion group on Facebook. How can people find that, James?
So if you look up @Through Sci-Fi or @Through Sci-Fi Pod, you'll be able to find us on Facebook, or you'll be able to find us on Twitter or Instagram, whatever your social media of choice. We're floating around on all of them. Also, if you could leave us a comment, a 5-star rating would be amazing. Helps all those podcast algorithms. So if you can get on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast service you use, leave a lovely comment. It always helps us out.
I think if you actually write a review, it's better for the algorithms. So if you want to leave us a review and tell us if you think Looper's time travel makes sense or not, and leave 5 stars, we will read that and we'll see what the verdict is from the listeners.
That's it from us. We'll see you next time.